I love to talk about how far technology has come, and this is the perfect example of that. This is IMAX, you could even vlog with. And this isn't your traditional 16:9 HD aspect ratio. It's actually 1.5:1. Today, I'm going to show you how to build a $2,000 IMAX camera. Of course, this isn't a true IMAX camera. You can't get that for $2,000, but we are going to talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of doing something like this. But before we do that, we need to talk about IMAX. What is IMAX? Well, the film size, or the sensor size and digital equivalent, is 70 millimeter, and IMAX film is massive.
70 millimeter IMAX. It's the highest quality imaging format ever devised.
The resolution is really hard to rate. Some lower estimates might be around 12K, some higher estimates might be around 18K, 20K resolution, but a conservative, safe, best case scenario resolution for IMAX film is 16K resolution. But even that is a little bit of an odd thing to rate, just because film is, it's a physical thing. It's not a digital sensor. So it's a little hard to rate in terms of resolution, but you can think of it as 16K.
We shot on the big boy format entirely. This is what we call large format in motion picture photography. It's just 65 millimeter.
And IMAX, true IMAX, has an aspect ratio of 1.43 to 1. If you're gonna go see an IMAX film, usually you wanna see the 1.43 to 1 version. Otherwise, we get into what is called LieMAX. And this is kind of the funny, mocking term for what now has been branded as IMAX, but isn't really true IMAX. It's LieMAX. And LieMAX, you could think of as something like not a true IMAX camera, but filmed for IMAX with something like an Alexa LF for large format. That's about a 36.7 by 25.5 millimeter full frame sensor is kind of the equivalent. Or you have something like the IMAX certified Alexa 65. That's a wider sensor at 54.12 by 25.59 millimeter size sensor. You'll notice the height on both of those sensors is about the same. It's just the width of the Alexa 65 that's much greater. But then you've also got the projected resolution. When you're actually watching the IMAX film in the theater, if it's only a 4K projection, because it's digital projection, that's not quite the true IMAX experience of seeing something on like 70 millimeter IMAX film. Very different case scenario. And you've also got the aspect ratio of LieMAX a lot of times being 1.9 to 1 or 2 to 1, which is similar in some ways to 16:9, but for the most part, it's just this wider aspect ratio. When people think of true IMAX, they're thinking massive sensor or film size. They're thinking really tall aspect ratio, still wider than tall. It's not square, but it is taller. And you've also got this crazy amount of resolution with true IMAX compared to, LieMAX being like 4K, which is very common nowadays. So somewhere between these two, I think we can find a sweet spot for a camera that is $2,000, give or take, that isn't quite IMAX, but is certainly better in some ways than what is being marketed as IMAX, or people call LieMAX. So let's talk about sensor size, because we really need to break this down. When we talk about full frame, a lot of times that's what sensors get compared to. Is it full frame? Because you've got APS-C, you've got Super 35, you've got Micro Four Thirds, you've got 1-inch sensors, but full frame, 35 millimeter film is 36 by 24 millimeters, okay? That's like your Sony full frames, your Canon full frames, Nikon, LieMAX, etc. Anything that's full frame is give or take about that size. There are some differences between the brands and manufacturers and where the sensor is made and all that stuff, but in general, 36 by 24 millimeters is full frame. Now, medium format is kind of where things are going nowadays. Medium format comes from film, but film medium format is totally different than digital medium format. Medium format in the digital space is bigger than full frame, but it does vary. So some digital medium format cameras are like 44 by 33 millimeters. So that is bigger, but maybe not as big as you might think. So maybe like a 1.7 times bigger. That would be something like the Fujifilm GFX camera line. There is bigger than full frame, so it's marketed as medium format. But there's other medium formats that are even bigger than that, like 54 by 40 millimeters. That's about 2.5 times larger than full frame. So medium format comes in a few different shapes and sizes, and even sometimes things that are called large format is actually just full frame sometimes. So you really got to be careful with those sensor sizes and what is marketing versus what is the physical actual size. But in general, whether you're talking about IMAX or anything else, it's usually the expectation would be that this is bigger than full frame. So even though some LieMAX cameras are full frame cameras, between full frame and IMAX, you have medium format. And I wanted to kind of point out these crop factors because these are important. Once full frame over the years has become the standard by which crop factors are determined. So if you have a full frame camera, the crop factor is set at 1. That's just become the standard. Anything beyond that, in terms of larger, gets a smaller crop factor, so a decimal crop factor, like less than 1. So you end up getting wider field of views equivalent. We're going to get into some of this later, some of the math, how it all plays out, but just pay attention. Medium format when it comes to Fujifilm GFX would be like a crop factor of almost like 0.8. But if you got even bigger than that, a medium format like Hasselblad, that crop factor would be like 0.65. Of course, if you go the other direction, you're going APS-C, then your crop factor is 1.5. If you go micro four thirds, you have a crop factor of 2. And it's just to kind of get an idea of how the lenses render. So the focal length of any lens is a optical characteristic of the lens. That never changes. The crop factor is what determines kind of that equivalent of what like looks similar on these different sensor sizes. Here's another display. This comes from wolfcrow.com. So he put together this kind of outline. You got IMAX film compared to Phase 1, compared to the Fuji GFX Eterna, or the Alexa 65, or the Ursa Cine 17K. You know, you've got all these different sensor sizes and how they compare to IMAX film. So that kind of gives you an understanding. 35 millimeter full frame being in the center, being the smallest in this display. But you can see, obviously IMAX is the biggest, but then maybe like not substantially so compared to something like Phase 1 or even the GFX Eterna. Now, let's talk about resolution. Beyond 4K is what I would think anyone would expect when you're talking about IMAX. IMAX quality certainly has to be bigger than 4K. Is it 6 to 8K like you're getting from a lot of cameras nowadays from Sony, Canon, Nikon, LieMAX, etc., right? All those full frame camera manufacturers, the photography cameras, these hybrids have really embraced that 6 to 8K or 7K sometimes, that sweet spot. But beyond that, you've got Blackmagic Design making 12K cameras now, or even 17K cameras on the horizon, but they've also got 16K cameras for VR, which is 8K and 8K side by side. Pick whichever you want. Obviously, the more resolution, the more expensive. So I think we're going to be in the ballpark of maybe more of that like 6 to 8K. So we're more resolution than LieMAX, certainly, but maybe not true IMAX, because again, that's 16K. That's hard to compete with digitally, but we'll do our best to get there at an affordable price point. We've also got to talk about aspect ratio, because it's the other big thing people associate with IMAX, that tall aspect ratio. Not very video-y, not very HD TV. So we need to get beyond that 16:9 TV aspect ratio. And we don't want to go wider. We're not going CinemaScope. We're not going 2.35. We're not going anamorphic, because that's a very cinema aesthetic, but it's not IMAX. IMAX is tall. So we need to look for something open gate, giving us that full sensor recording. Now, if you have a full frame camera, chances are it's a 3:2 sensor. That's a 1.5 to 1 aspect ratio, which is very close to that IMAX aspect ratio of 1.43 to 1. 1.43 to 1 is a little taller. Even taller still, surprisingly, is micro four thirds at 1.33 to 1. That's a 4:3 aspect ratio. So if you're able to get open gate recording full sensor, whether it's full frame or micro four thirds, somewhere around there is very close to the aspect ratio you would get from proper IMAX, surprisingly enough, which is one of the cool things about open gate. And people saying that it's overrated or it's not that important. If you want to achieve some of these cool results that I'm going to show you here in a little bit of how you do it, you kind of need a camera that can do open gate, just to kind of match what the IMAX cameras are doing at a much larger level, much more expensive level. So let's talk about the camera itself and the kit. The $2,000 kit that I'm talking about and showing you examples for in this video is a LieMAX S5 Mark II. Those are less than $1,500 now. Sometimes they're on sale for $1,500, sometimes $1,600. Of course, depends on your market, your region, but used, you can find them for $1,400, $1,300, $1,200 even I've seen in some cases. The LieMAX S5 Mark II lets us do some of those cool things we're gonna talk about. And you need a focal reducer because we want to go beyond full frame. So think of this like a speed booster for full frame to go beyond full frame, to get closer to those medium format sensor sizes. Of course, it's not identical. Of course, there's some benefits to having true medium format, but the price point is significantly higher. You can get a focal reducer for $400 to $500, and you can't just use full frame lenses because with that larger, that larger sensor size equivalent, we need some proper medium format lenses that we can use with that focal reducer. So that price fluctuates depending on what you find, but you can certainly piece together a kit for around $2,000. And I'm gonna show you how that breaks down here in a moment. If you look at something like the S5 Mark II from LieMAX, even with a lens, you can find that used on eBay. I found this listing for $1,400. Region is going to vary. Obviously, the listing, when you're looking what's sold out, what's in stock, it's all going to depend. But even with a lens, I was able to find this camera for $1,400. That focal reducer, $500 new, but you can find them used for $450, $400. Maybe there's a sale going on, so around that price point. And we're going to use the Mamiya lenses on the L mount. We'll get into that in a second. And what are the advantages of a setup like this? Well, first, it's affordable, okay? I don't think many of us have the hundreds of thousands of dollars to drop on an IMAX camera. You can't even buy them. They're only available to rent realistically. And I think last time I checked, prices were like $15,000 to $20,000 a week just to rent an IMAX camera. That doesn't even include the film stock. That's just to have the camera itself. So very, very expensive. Obviously, if you're Christopher Nolan, you can afford it, but most of us, we can't reach that high, or we don't have those deep of pockets. So this is affordable. It's also got 6K resolution. We could push that even further, which we'll talk about in a moment, but it also gives us open gate. Those LieMAX cameras, along with some of the others nowadays, Canon has embraced open gate, Nikon, we'll see, Sony, who knows, but LieMAX and Canon and Blackmagic are giving some open gate offerings. So that's important for that IMAX aspect ratio, that taller, look compared to what you would normally get with traditional Ultra HD 4K or standard HD 1080p. Alternatively, you could spend a little bit more and have some additional benefits. If you looked at something like the LieMAX S1R Mark II, that would give you open gate and 8K. So beyond 6K, you could have 8K resolution with the LieMAX S1R Mark II, or alternatively, you could go with something like the LieMAX S1 Mark II. That would give you open gate, full sensor, 60 frames a second. So you could actually do slow motion open gate, full sensor. You could also look at something like Canon and the R6 Mark III and some of the new offerings from Canon, because you can actually do 7K raw open gate on some of those cameras. Pretty cool what we're able to do nowadays. And of course, the price point, fluctuates depending on how new the camera is. But the LieMAX S5 Mark II, I just used for this because I have it. I'm not spending any money adding, but we do have some advantages and some benefits. Now, let's talk about the lenses, because that's kind of the most important part of this whole equation. If we're going to be shooting more medium format in terms of look and feel, we need actual medium format lenses. So you can find these on eBay used. These are Mamiya. They're older lenses, but still, many of them are in decent enough condition. So I found this one on eBay. This is an 80mm f1.9. This was around, $350 to $400. Again, price point is going to fluctuate depending on condition, depending on location, all that. I also picked up a Mamiya, a 45mm lens. That's an f2.8. So I got an 80mm and a 45mm. This one was much cheaper. It's kind of broken. I'm checking. The aperture is just stuck wide open. I don't know exactly what the problem is. Maybe I'll take it apart and tinker it a little bit, but much cheaper, $170 for a lens. And when you think of like a cheap lens, like 170, that's about the cheapest lens you could find nowadays. Granted, these aren't autofocus. There's no, electronic communication happening. These are dumb lenses, but if you were around for the DSLR revolution, or back in the day when everything was going mirrorless and you got comfortable adapting older, more manual style lenses to modern digital cameras for the benefits in 1080p and in 4K, this is kind of taking that, just reinventing the wheel yet again, taking these medium format lenses, adapting them to full frame through a focal reducer to get that medium format look on a more affordable full frame camera. The same reason we did it back in the day on Micro Four Thirds with speed boosters and adapting Super 35 or APS-C lenses or even full frame lenses to Micro Four Thirds. You can actually do this, take it, that next step further and do medium format to full frame, right? You can do a lot with technology and it's very cool. In terms of field of view, let's talk about those equivalents because people do always like to relate everything to full frame. When I say full frame, I don't mean the best. I don't mean the only option. I don't mean the pinnacle of technology. It's just what we call it, full frame. Medium format, you're still getting the full sensor as well. So it's like, that's full frame. I don't know, whatever. It's just the terminology that has stuck. Full frame, 35 millimeter. That full frame equivalent in terms of field of view, when you adapt these lenses, so an 80 millimeter medium format lens, this Mamiya, would actually be like more like a 56 millimeter in terms of full frame equivalent. So if you're used to shooting something like 55 millimeters on full frame, that's what an 80 millimeter, that's what the lens you would need in terms of medium format to match a similar look. Same thing for that 45 millimeter Mamiya lens. The equivalent in terms of full frame would be 32 millimeters. So if you're used to like a 30 millimeter perspective, kind of getting closer to that like wide end of the spectrum, definitely wider than what most would consider like a medium-ish lens, you would need something more like a 45, which a lot of times people would associate with like a normal or medium lens. Certainly not telephoto. 80 millimeters is where you get more in that like portrait telephoto range. But again, if you look, in terms of medium format, that's actually more like just a normal lens in medium format. So really make sure you're paying attention to that crop factor, field of view, what the equivalents are to get comfortable with what you might expect. So if you're looking for a telephoto medium format lens, you probably have to go longer, in terms of focal length than you might expect. And then same thing for the wide end. You might want that ultra wide, and you might be looking for something like a 16 millimeter. Well, that doesn't really exist for medium format. You'd have to look at something like, maybe more like a 28 or something. I don't know what the math is off the top of my head, but it's just not always what you expect. So make sure you're doing your crop factor, that 0.7 crop factor, because that's what you get with the focal reducer. You gotta do that math to get the field of view equivalent. Now, let's talk about the results, because I was actually very impressed and very surprised with this test. In terms of performance, surprisingly sharp. I don't know, maybe it's just my history with older vintage lenses, this manual focus style, and everything nowadays when it comes from a digital, clinical perspective. That's what people associate with modern lenses. The new technology, people is like very sharp, very detailed. And I was getting surprising results from these Mamiya lenses that in my mind, I just felt like, oh, it's gonna be a little soft. It's not gonna be, pixel perfect. It's not gonna be optically that sharp because I'm adapting and going through this focal reducer. And in fact, quite the opposite. It was pleasantly sharp and detailed without being overly sharp. Of course, it wasn't razor clinical. The things that people criticize often about modern lenses is that they're too good. I think the modern lenses are great, actually, and I love the benefits like autofocus, but I do understand what people are saying sometimes when it's like too good. I was getting great results with these lenses. I thought they looked awesome in terms of optical clarity. Of course, dealing with manual focus, so I can't do the subject tracking, face tracking, human detection. I can't do any of that cool stuff. Got to do it old school, manual focus. But hey, that's fine. I'm used to it. No big deal. And you are getting that extreme depth of field. If you think full frame is shallow, go medium format. And those wide open apertures, even at like an f2.8, with that focal reducer, like it's so shallow. And yes, you can achieve similar results on full frame if you're using the fastest glass out there. Think like a 1.2 on full frame, which I think is kind of the equivalent of that 1.9 once you do the crop factor equivalent, would be more like an f1, 1.2. Just extremely shallow, especially wide open. That extreme depth of field that you probably have noticed in a lot of those Christopher Nolan movies. When you're shooting IMAX and you got these, these massive film stock, you've got to like stop down on that aperture, and even then it's still extremely shallow, that depth of field. And you get that extreme field of view that really is hard to put into words other than just looking at the images, because now you've got this kind of ultra wide field of view, even at a kind of normal focal length. And I don't know, there's something just breathtaking about it when you look at the images, how rich and visually striking they are. There's something about it. Now, would anyone notice if I didn't tell them? Probably not. A lot of viewers, your general audience isn't really going to notice, other than maybe they'll think, hey, it's too blurry, which is a common problem nowadays, that everything is just bokeh and background blur. So use it in moderation. But one of the things I like the most about this type of setup is that it's so compact and lightweight. If I imagine filming with an IMAX camera and just how big and bulky and clunky, that works for Hollywood, that works for a proper film set. But if you just want to film for fun, for YouTube, or maybe it's a client project and you want a unique look, a unique characteristic, and still be able to crop vertical for social, because that's the thing. Usually when people are talking about aesthetics and giving a look and feel to the footage, people will talk about shooting anamorphic and shooting ultra wide. And yes, that gives you a look, but in the modern landscape of social media, nothing is wide, everything is tall. And so with this approach, shooting more IMAX style, yes, we're shooting LieMAX, of course, but we're shooting with this taller aspect ratio in mind as a benefit, as an aesthetic. You still have your horizontal 16:9 crops if you want to take them, but you also have vertical resolution to play with as well. Anamorphic is very limiting to CinemaScope, those ultra wide aspect ratios. It's really cool to shoot anamorphic, but also you can get a unique look shooting this way, taking full frame, going beyond to more of a medium format space, and using some of these more unique lenses that you're not going to find at Best Buy or Walmart. Now, to actually compare the build that I made versus IMAX, you can see it still pales in comparison. This build, the equivalent field of view, sensor size, however you want to say it, would be like a 51 by 34 millimeter sensor size. Again, we're using a focal reducer, so it's not identical, but that's kind of the equivalent that you get. That's still a far cry from true IMAX, which is 70 by 52 millimeters in terms of the film. So we're kind of a bit off there in terms of sensor size when it comes to this cheap digital build, but we are bigger than full frame in terms of the sensor size equivalent. And we're only shooting 6K. We could push that to 8K if I had something like the S1R Mark II, and I would take those resolution benefits, certainly, but I'm limited to 6K, which is vastly inferior to the 16K plus potential that you'd get with true IMAX film. And that aspect ratio, it's not quite there. It's 1.5 to 1 versus true IMAX, which would be 1.43 to 1. So not quite as tall. If we went micro four thirds, of course, we'd get a taller aspect ratio, but we'd be reducing that sensor size. So it's really kind of a trade-off, how you want to approach it. For me, it made sense to start with full frame and reach to medium format to try and, grasp a little bit there at real IMAX. But let's compare it to LieMAX, because that's where I think things start to look a lot more interesting. So with my build, the LieMAX S5 Mark II, my sensor size equivalent, being 51 by 34 millimeters, is actually larger than what a lot of the LieMAX cameras, those Alexas that are used in Hollywood productions, those sensors are actually smaller. So the field of view, all that stuff is actually to the advantage of this build. And same with the resolution. We talk about projecting IMAX in a theater if it's only being shown at 4K. Well, we're certainly still above that in terms of resolution, shooting 6K. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. And that aspect ratio is taller than what you would see otherwise in a theater. LieMAX, not the true IMAX, but just you go to a generic, AMC that has IMAX or whatever, they'll probably show you a 1.9 by 1 aspect ratio film. So we're kind of winning in the $2,000 build category compared to what might be out there advertised, in the theaters and put on the movie posters, etc. So when you break it down and you compare the $2,000 build versus a potentially $500,000 real IMAX camera, I think you start to see it's like, hey, we're actually getting pretty close with something so cheap. Yes, we're not there yet. We're not shooting true IMAX on a $2,000 camera, but it's also not nothing. It's actually decently impressive, all things considered. So what's the takeaway? Well, to me, it's all about the power of being able to do this. The technology is so affordable and the equipment is available. This is all possible. You can do this just shopping on Amazon and eBay. It's not that hard. And the education as far as what you can go consume on YouTube and learn from professionals when it comes to lighting and set design and choreography and production and editing, all of it, you can find for free on YouTube. And so it just comes down to you and your appetite. Are you willing to learn? Do you want to embrace some of these things? Because it's not that expensive, it's all available, and it's all accessible. Then ultimately, it just comes down to what are you gonna do with it? Because it's one thing for me to put together some footage and a test video for YouTube, but it's got me scratching my head going, how can I use this? How can I make the most of it? What can I do unique with this type of setup that I couldn't do any other way? And I love those creative possibilities because it's so fun to experiment, to try something new, to figure it out, to troubleshoot, to problem solve. I love doing all of it. And to be able to say, hey, this is almost as good as IMAX for $2,000 with parts that I kind of already had, or any new ones I needed to get were not that expensive, all things considered. That to me is the joy of production and video and being creative and doing something with so little. I've always gravitated towards maybe the lower end of the spectrum. Even if I have the budget, even if I have the resources, it's still so fun to tinker and to play with what is some of the cheapest equipment out there that can actually deliver some of the most impressive results.